On December 14, 2025, Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead inside their Los Angeles home. The medical examiner classified both deaths as homicide, citing multiple sharp force injuries. Within hours, a judge ordered key records sealed at the request of investigators. No explanations. No timelines filled in, just a locked file and a nation watching. One arrest followed. Charges were filed, and then the silence widened. When the facts stop and the speculation begins, who controls the story? If you follow investigations where truth competes with noise, consider subscribing. This is not about solving a case. It is about how a confirmed death turned into a frenzy of narratives before the evidence was allowed to speak. Rob Reiner was not just a recognizable name. For more than 4 decades, he occupied a rare position in American culture, visible enough to be familiar to the general public, powerful enough to shape projects behind the camera, and outspoken enough to attract both admiration and hostility. His work crossed genres and generations, embedding itself into the collective memory of audiences who may not have followed his career closely, but still felt they knew who he was. That visibility matters. When public figures pass quietly, their deaths are often absorbed as footnotes. When figures like Reiner die suddenly, violently, and inside their own home, the event does not remain private for long. It collides with expectations. A life associated with control, influence, and longevity does not end this way in the public imagination. That mismatch is where the story begins to metastasize. The shock was not only that Rob Reiner died, it was how quickly the circumstances broke from the familiar script. A homicide classification immediately reframed the event from personal tragedy into public mystery. The involvement of law enforcement, followed by an arrest connected to the family, added another layer of discomfort. And then came the detail that changed the rhythm of the story entirely. Investigative records were sealed, while the case remained active. In the modern media environment, sealed information does not create patience. It creates pressure. News outlets report what they can confirm. Social platforms fill the gaps with inference. YouTube, in particular, thrives on unresolved narratives because uncertainty invites repetition. Each retelling promises clarity while quietly acknowledging that clarity is unavailable. Reiner's death arrived at the intersection of 3 forces that amplify speculation. First, familiarity. Audiences felt they knew him, which created a sense of personal violation when details were withheld. Second, contradiction. A successful, wealthy, elderly public figure dying violently inside his own home does not align with cultural expectations of how such lives conclude. Third, silence. The absence of official detail created an information vacuum, and vacuums do not remain empty for long. This is where the story stopped being only about what happened and started becoming about how stories are made. Within days, timelines were compressed, old interviews resurfaced, unrelated controversies were reframed as clues, and fragments of verified reporting were rearranged into narratives that sounded complete but were not. The line between reporting and interpretation blurred, then vanished. What followed was predictable and yet revealing. Some voices claimed certainty. Others claimed hidden knowledge. Many framed speculation as courage, implying that restraint meant complicity. In that environment, the loudest version of the story gained traction, not the most accurate one. This video does not attempt to replace an investigation or anticipate a verdict. It examines how a single confirmed event triggered a cascade of assumptions, and why, in cases like this, the story people consume can outrun the truth that actually exists. On the morning of December 14, 2025, police entered a quiet Los Angeles home. By the time they left, 2 deaths had been classified as homicide. That morning, authorities responded to a call at a private residence in Los Angeles. Inside, they found Rob Reiner and his wife deceased. Both deaths were later classified by the medical examiner as homicide, with the cause described as multiple sharp force injuries. From the moment that determination was made, the narrative surrounding this case changed permanently. In criminal investigations, classification matters. An accidental death closes doors. A medical emergency narrows focus. A homicide opens everything. It activates law enforcement protocols, forensic timelines, prosecutorial scrutiny, and public records requests. It also signals to the public that whatever happened was not random, not natural, and not without human agency. That single word shifted the event from tragedy into investigation. Within hours, the first official statements were careful and limited. Authorities confirmed the deaths, confirmed the classification, and confirmed that the case was active. They did not provide a timeline of events. They did not name a suspect. They did not speculate about motive. This restraint was procedural, but to an audience conditioned to instant explanations, it felt evasive. Later that same day, an arrest was made. The individual taken into custody was Rob Reiner's adult son, Nick Reiner. Prosecutors subsequently filed charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. A brief court appearance followed, and an arraignment date was scheduled for early January. These facts were reported plainly, without embellishment, but their implications were explosive. The involvement of a family member immediately reframed public perception. Crimes committed by strangers provoke fear. Crimes alleged within families provoke disbelief. They disrupt the most basic assumption audiences carry into stories about public figures: that success insulates private life from collapse. The case now carried a psychological weight that extended beyond legal boundaries. Then came the detail that intensified everything. At the request of investigators, a judge ordered key records sealed while the investigation continued. This included portions of the medical examiner's documentation and related evidentiary material. The justification was standard, preserving the integrity of an active case. The effect, however, was anything but standard. Sealed records create asymmetry. Law enforcement sees more than the public. Prosecutors know more than reporters. Defense attorneys know more than audiences. That imbalance is necessary for justice, but it also creates an environment where imagination rushes to compensate for absence. In high-profile cases, silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is interpreted as concealment, even when it is procedural. From a purely factual standpoint, the confirmed timeline at this stage was narrow. 2 deaths, 1 classification, 1 arrest, charges filed, records sealed, court dates pending. Everything else existed outside that frame. But the human mind resists narrow frames. Viewers, commentators, and creators began expanding the timeline backward and forward, searching for meaning. Past interviews were revisited, not as reflections, but as evidence. Old disagreements were reframed as warnings. Neutral biographical details were recast as foreshadowing. In online spaces, the distinction between relevance and coincidence eroded quickly. If something could be connected, it was. This was the first irreversible turn, not just for the case, but for the story around it. Once an arrest occurs, narratives tend to crystallize. People choose sides. Some assume guilt because charges exist. Others assume innocence because a trial has not yet happened. Very few remain suspended in uncertainty, because uncertainty offers no emotional resolution. What made this case uniquely volatile was how little verified information existed between the confirmed points. The public knew when the deaths were discovered, how they were classified, and who was charged. They did not know what happened in the hours before. They did not know the sequence inside the house. They did not know what evidence supported the charges. That absence became the center of gravity for everything that followed. Traditional journalism attempted to hold the line. Reports repeated the same confirmed facts. Updates focused on procedural steps rather than speculation. But the rhythm of the internet does not reward repetition. It rewards novelty. When facts stop changing, interpretation takes over. This is where the story split into 2 parallel tracks. On one track, the legal process moved slowly, deliberately, and mostly out of public view. On the other, a cultural process accelerated. The death of a public figure became raw material. The arrest became a hook. The sealed records became proof, in the minds of some, that something extraordinary was being hidden. The danger of this moment is not that people ask questions. Questions are inevitable. The danger is that questions are answered prematurely, and those answers harden into beliefs before evidence is examined in court. Once that happens, corrections rarely carry the same weight as the initial claim. By the end of the first week, the case had not progressed legally in any dramatic way. No trial had begun. No evidence had been presented publicly. And yet, for many observers, the story already felt complete. That illusion of completeness is the most powerful force in modern true crime culture. The first irreversible turn was not the homicide classification. It was the moment when silence met speculation, and speculation found an audience. In most criminal cases, silence is temporary and local. In this one, silence became global within days. The decision to seal key records was legally routine but culturally combustible. To investigators, it was about protecting evidence, witness statements, and the integrity of a future trial. To the public, it felt like a door being closed at the exact moment curiosity was at its peak. Information gaps are not neutral spaces. They invite interpretation. When facts are incomplete, People do not wait. They infer. They connect. They project. And when the subject is a public figure, those projections arrive preloaded with assumptions built over decades of visibility. Sealed records do not mean no information exists. They mean information exists unevenly. Law enforcement has access. Prosecutors have access. Defense attorneys have access. Reporters, creators, and viewers do not. That imbalance creates a hierarchy of knowledge, and hierarchies of knowledge create suspicion, especially in an era trained to distrust institutions. The mechanics of this are predictable. A single confirmed detail becomes overworked. The phrase multiple sharp force injuries is repeated until it loses specificity and gains symbolism. It stops being a medical description and starts being treated as narrative proof of intensity, intent, or emotion, none of which can be responsibly inferred without context. A procedural court order becomes a narrative device. The act of sealing records is reframed as evidence of something extraordinary rather than evidence of caution. What follows is not a search for truth, but a competition of explanations. In that competition, speed beats accuracy, certainty beats nuance, and emotional coherence beats legal restraint. Stories that feel complete travel faster than stories that admit what they do not know. This is where the role of platform incentives becomes impossible to ignore. YouTube does not reward waiting. It rewards engagement. Engagement spikes when viewers believe they are being shown something hidden, something suppressed, something others are afraid to say. A sealed document is not just a legal measure in that ecosystem. It is a marketing asset. Creators begin to ask different questions, not about what happened, but about what could plausibly be claimed. Old footage is reframed. Public statements made years earlier are edited into new contexts. Tone replaces evidence. A raised eyebrow becomes implication. A pause becomes confession. None of it requires fabrication. It requires only rearrangement. The audience, meanwhile, is not passive. Viewers arrive with expectations shaped by decades of true crime storytelling. They have learned narrative patterns. They anticipate motives. They look for psychological profiles. When official sources refuse to provide those elements, unofficial sources step in to supply them. Silence also alters the moral posture of speculation. When authorities speak, contradicting them feels risky. When authorities do not speak, speculation can be framed as bravery. The absence of official explanation becomes permission. In that space, restraint is reframed as compliance, and conjecture is reframed as truth-seeking. This is not unique to this case, but it is intensified by proximity. The alleged involvement of a family member collapses the distance audiences normally maintain. The story is no longer abstract. It becomes intimate, and intimacy lowers the threshold for judgment. Viewers do not ask whether they should know more. They ask why they are not being told more. The paradox is that the legal system moves slowly precisely because it understands the cost of being wrong. The public sphere moves quickly because it bears no such cost. A video can be deleted. A headline can be changed. A theory can be abandoned without consequence. The people involved in the case do not have that luxury. As days pass without new verified information, repetition takes over. The same facts are restated, then restated again, each time wrapped in slightly different language. Eventually, the framing becomes the story. People remember how they heard about the case more than what they actually know about it. This is the moment when speculation becomes self-sustaining. It no longer depends on new developments. It feeds on reaction. One theory prompts a rebuttal. The rebuttal prompts a counter. Each side claims rationality. Each accuses the other of bias. And the center, where uncertainty lives, disappears. What makes this phase dangerous is not that it exists, but that it hardens. Once audiences invest emotionally in a version of events, evidence that contradicts that version is experienced as threat rather than information. At that point, the investigation becomes secondary. The story has already been decided in the minds of many. The sealed records did not create speculation. They accelerated it. They transformed absence into meaning. And they shifted the focus away from process toward performance. By the time the legal system takes its next visible step, the public may already feel finished with the story. That dissonance between legal time and media time is where the deepest misunderstandings form. This chapter is not about defending silence or condemning curiosity. It is about recognizing the moment when a lack of information stops being a gap and starts becoming a narrative engine. Once the information gap was established, the story entered a new phase. This was no longer about what had happened, but about what could be made to sound plausible. The absence of verified detail did not slow the narrative. It reorganized it. What emerged was a rumor machine, driven not by a single falsehood, but by a pattern. The same pattern appears in almost every high-profile case where facts are scarce and emotions are high. 5 dominant narratives began to circulate. None of them required proof to spread. They required only familiarity, repetition, and confidence. The first was the motive narrative. This is the most instinctive response to violent crime. Viewers ask why before they ask how. In this frame, every known detail becomes potential motive material. Finances are examined. Estate planning is scrutinized. Past disagreements are reframed as fault lines. The word legacy is repeated until it starts to imply conflict by itself. What is rarely acknowledged is that motive is not evidence. It is a story device. Without corroboration, it explains nothing, but it feels explanatory, and that feeling is enough to carry it forward. The second was the psychological narrative. This version looks inward rather than outward. It assembles a portrait of mental strain, instability, or crisis using fragments of reported behavior and second-hand impressions. Old interviews are replayed. Anecdotes are isolated from context. Silence is interpreted as distress. The danger here is subtle. Psychological explanations can sound compassionate while quietly assigning causation. They allow speculation to masquerade as concern, and once framed this way, any contradictory fact is dismissed as surface-level misunderstanding. The third was the political narrative. This one had little to do with the deaths themselves and everything to do with public identity. Past statements were reintroduced as character evidence. Political disagreements were reframed as enemies. The tragedy was pulled into existing ideological conflicts, not because the facts supported it, but because those conflicts were already primed. In this narrative, the case was not a crime. It was a symbol. And symbols do not need evidence to function. The fourth was the coincidence narrative. This version thrives on timelines. It strings together unrelated events and presents proximity as meaning. A recent appearance, a resurfaced clip, a scheduling detail. None of these elements prove anything on their own, but when arranged sequentially, they create the illusion of pattern. Coincidence becomes foreshadowing. Timing becomes intent. This narrative is particularly persuasive because it feels analytical. It uses structure without substance. The fifth was the meta-narrative. This is the claim that the real story is being hidden. It does not require a specific theory. It requires only the assertion that official explanations cannot be trusted. In this frame, every denial is confirmation. Every sealed document is proof. Every delay is a cover. The meta-narrative is the most durable because it cannot be disproven. Its strength lies in its immunity to evidence. What all 5 narratives share is a common feature. They do not compete with each other. They coexist. Viewers can move between them without friction, adopting whichever version best fits their existing beliefs. This flexibility is not accidental. It is engineered by platforms that reward sustained engagement rather than resolution. The rumor machine does not invent facts. It repurposes them. A confirmed arrest becomes a placeholder for guilt. A sealed record becomes a sign of conspiracy. A lack of public statements becomes an admission of shame. Each step is small. Each step is defensible in isolation. Together, they create a complete story that feels earned, even though it rests on inference. Creators participating in this ecosystem often present themselves as cautious. They use phrases like reportedly, allegedly, sources suggest. But tone does more work than language. A raised voice, a dramatic pause, a thumbnail that promises revelation. These elements guide interpretation long before disclaimers arrive. By the time the caveats appear, the conclusion has already formed. The audience plays a role as well. Viewers are not simply misled. They are trained. Years of true crime content have taught them to read between the lines, to distrust official restraint, and to equate emotional intensity with authenticity. When a creator appears calm, measured, and decisive, viewers interpret that as credibility, regardless of sourcing. This is how rumor becomes normalized, not as a lie, but as a plausible alternative. Once normalized, it stops feeling like speculation and starts feeling like common knowledge. People repeat it not because they believe it is true, but because they believe everyone else believes it is true. At this stage, a correction becomes almost impossible. Any attempt to slow the narrative is framed as censorship. Any reminder of legal process is framed as naivety. The investigation is accused of lagging behind the truth, when in reality, the truth has not yet been established. What makes this especially troubling is that the people most affected by the outcome have no voice in this phase. They are advised to remain silent. Their silence is interpreted. They are bound by legal constraints. Those constraints are treated as suspicious. The imbalance of power shifts. The loudest voices gain authority not because they know more, but because they are willing to say more. By the time this chapter of the story reaches its peak, the case has split in two. There is the case that exists in court, governed by rules of evidence and due process. And there is the case that exists online, governed by attention and belief. These two cases may share a name, but they are no longer the same. The rumor machine does not need a conclusion. It needs momentum, and momentum is sustained by uncertainty. While speculation accelerated online, another process unfolded more quietly. It did not trend. It did not generate thumbnails, but it carried real weight. This was the human fallout, the phase where a life's work and a family's grief began colliding with a public narrative they did not control. In the days following the deaths, responses from colleagues and industry figures followed a familiar pattern. Statements were careful. Language was restrained. The focus was on contribution rather than circumstance. People spoke about decades of work, about influence, about presence. They avoided the case. They avoided conjecture. To some viewers, that restraint looked evasive. To those inside the industry, it was respect. This divergence matters. Public mourning and private mourning do not move at the same speed, and they do not serve the same purpose. Public mourning often demands explanation. Private mourning requires protection. When those two collide, the quieter one is often mistaken for indifference or guilt. As tributes circulated, a subtle tension became visible. Some viewers accused silence of complicity. Others accused remembrance of denial. The question underlying both reactions was the same. How can a legacy be honored when its ending is unresolved? In an environment driven by immediacy, unresolved feels unacceptable. What makes this phase particularly painful is that legacy is not an abstract concept. It is built from memory, repetition, and framing. When the final chapter of a life becomes the most repeated one, it begins to overwrite the earlier pages. For figures whose careers spanned decades, this compression can feel like erasure. There is also a structural imbalance at work. Institutions can afford patience. Individuals cannot. A studio can wait for a verdict. An archive can wait for clarity. A family cannot pause grief while speculation runs. Every new theory, every recycled clip, every confident assertion reopens wounds that have not been allowed to close. This is where the internet's version of justice diverges most sharply from the legal one. The legal system is designed to protect against irreversible error. The public sphere is not. Once a belief is formed, it does not wait for permission to act. It spreads. It hardens. It becomes part of how the story is remembered. For younger audiences encountering Rob Reiner primarily through this event, context collapses. A career becomes a footnote. A body of work becomes background noise. The name becomes shorthand for controversy rather than contribution. That shift does not require malice. It requires only repetition. There is another layer to the fallout that rarely receives attention. When a case becomes cultural property, it stops belonging to the people most affected. Every detail is debated. Every silence is analyzed. Every delay is interpreted. The humanity of those involved is replaced by roles in a narrative. Victim, suspect, icon, villain. None of these roles account for complexity. In this phase, even caution can be weaponized. Lawyers advising silence are framed as suppressors. Journalists adhering to verification are framed as complicit. Grief is framed as avoidance. The expectation is not truth, but performance. To speak is to be scrutinized. To remain silent is to be accused. This environment also distorts empathy. Viewers feel involved, even invested, but that investment is one-directional. It does not carry responsibility. When speculation is wrong, there is no recall. When assumptions collapse, there is no correction equal in reach to the original claim. The cost is absorbed by those who never consented to participate. Legacy in this context becomes fragile. It depends not only on what was done, but on what is said last and loudest. In earlier eras, time softened endings. Distance allowed reassessment. In the current cycle, endings are frozen mid-chaos and replayed indefinitely. The irony is that many of the values celebrated in tributes, patience, rigor, accountability are the same values missing from the speculative ecosystem surrounding the case. The contradiction is rarely acknowledged. It is easier to consume certainty than to sit with uncertainty. This chapter is not an argument for silence. It is an argument for proportion. A recognition that not every question can be answered on demand, and not every story benefits from acceleration. Some truths require time. Some processes require restraint. As the legal case continues on its own schedule, the cultural case has already moved on, carrying with it assumptions that may never be revisited. The outcome in court will matter, but it will arrive in a landscape already shaped by belief. What remains unresolved is not only what happened inside a house on a specific day, but how society chooses to remember a life when its final chapter is written in fragments. At this point, there is only one version of the story that deserves certainty, what has been officially confirmed. 2 lives ended violently. An investigation is active. Charges have been filed. A legal process is underway. Everything beyond that remains incomplete, no matter how confidently it is presented. And yet the public story already feels finished to many. That is the central contradiction of this case. The legal system is still assembling facts, while the cultural system has already assembled meaning. In the space between those 2 timelines, assumption has filled the role that evidence has not yet been allowed to occupy. This is not a failure of curiosity. It is a failure of patience. The modern audience has been trained to expect closure, to equate silence with deception, and to treat unresolved tragedy as an invitation rather than a boundary. In that environment, speculation does not feel reckless. It feels responsible. But responsibility without accountability produces distortion, not truth. Rob Reiner's legacy now sits at the intersection of 2 forces. One is slow, methodical, and constrained by rules designed to prevent irreversible harm. The other is fast, emotional, and unconstrained, driven by engagement rather than outcome. Which of those forces defines how he is remembered will depend less on the verdict than on whether audiences are willing to revise what they think they already know. There is a cost to getting this wrong, not just for the people directly involved, but for the public's relationship with truth itself. When belief hardens before evidence is tested, correction becomes almost impossible. Stories do not simply inform, they shape judgment. If you believe complex cases deserve time, context, and restraint, you can support work like this by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Share your perspective in the comments, not with certainty, but with questions worth asking. Because the most important part of this story has not happened yet. And how it is received may say as much about us as it does about the case itself.